Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Immigration Brief. My name is David Fullmer, and I am a partner in the Los Angeles offices of WR Immigration. Today, I'm joined, as always, by my partner, Naveen Bhora, who is the managing partner of our New York office. Hi, Naveen.
Hi, David. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Today, we're talking about something that is very important, and it's become more important this last year. We're talking about how to prepare for different types of interviews. And the interview is very important because it's the time where the foreign national actually interfaces directly with the US government. And it comes up in a few contexts, both the non-immigrant visa interview at the US consulate, the adjustment of status interview at USCIS, and of course, in the context of naturalization. And finally, there is sort of an interview when someone crosses the border and applies for admission to the United States, especially if they're Canadian and if they're applying for something like a TN or L1, there's definitely going to be an interview. So it's really important that people are prepared, that they know what they're doing. And it's more important this year because, prior to this year, during the Biden administration, a lot of the non-immigrant visas interviews were waived and people really didn't have to worry about it. They were able to, um, drop off their application in a Dropbox and get their visa stamped and have it come back to them. And similarly, with both employment-based and family-based adjustments of status, many interviews are waived, but that's not the case anymore. And so people really need to be prepared. So the first area that I wanted to discuss was the non-immigrant visa interview. Again, in the current environment, most interviews are not waived. The Dropbox, the interview that we loved is pretty much gone. And if someone is somewhere between 14 and 79 years old, and I think there's one exception where if you're applying for a B visa renewal within 12 months, you don't have to have an interview, but just about every other applicant will have to appear at the U.S. consulate for an interview. And the type of preparation and the focus of the interview will vary depending on the type of visa that someone is applying for. If they're applying for, say, a B1, F1, or J visa, temporary intent is going to be the focus. Temporary intent means that the applicant will need to show strong ties to their home country abroad, including that we call family, social, and economic ties. So again, having family, having either a job or job prospects back home, having connections like property. And so these are the types of things that we'll be able to help an applicant for one of these visas. Again, B, F, J. These are visas where there's a 214, strong 214B requirement where the person needs to prove that they will return. And so when going to these interviews, whether it's a J visa, an F visa, B visa, or even for an H1 or an L1, when you go in for an interview, um, you need to make sure that you're prepared. Make sure that when you answer questions, you keep it very short and precise and consistent with the DS-160. It's also important to make sure that when you're completing the DS-160, your answers and the way you complete the form is consistent with what you've done in the past. So keep in mind, if you've applied for a B visa in the past or F visa in the past, things need to be consistent. It's also important to make sure that you bring all of the required documents. And, the list of documents will vary a little bit depending on the type of visa that's being applied for. And so an applicant will need to consult with counsel and with HR mobility managers to make sure they have all the required documents. For example, if it's going to be an H-1B, they'll need a full copy of the petition, LCA, usually an employment verification letter. And so it's important for HR mobility managers to understand that the applicants will need certain documents and to be cooperative and helpful to them. And the foreign national going in for the interview will also need to always check the website of the consulate where they're going to make sure that there's nothing a little bit different or there's no special requirements. So that's a few things on the documents. And then, these non-immigrant visa interviews are very quick. I've heard people say that, the interview can be somewhere between, 5 and 10 minutes. So it's very, very quick. There's not much of an opportunity to have an in-depth interview. So the foreign national needs to be prepared for whatever they might be asked. and be able to, sort of think on their feet because it will not be a long interview. And then likewise, if a Canadian is applying for a TN visa, there will be a similar interview, and you need to have the paperwork in order and be prepared for that interview at the port of entry. Wow, that was a lot to go through. Thanks for going through that with me. Now, let's talk a little bit about the type of questions that come up. Naveen, do you want to touch on the type of questions that you've seen or you've heard about people being asked at the interview?
Yeah, thanks for going through all of that, David. That's a lot of really great tips on preparing for these interviews. And also, I know it's been a while since people had to attend an interview at a consulate, so maybe it would be good for the global mobility team to consider having their immigration counsel prepare their applicants before they go in, because sometimes we forget what is actually required for these interviews. So certainly, where you have a blanket L application, which is the first time someone's presenting their petition to the consulate, it's really important that the individual is well prepared. They understand what's in the packet and how to present. And then with other petitions where you already have an approval from immigration in hand, maybe it's not as critical. You just have to be convincing that you are the person being described in the petition. So for all of these work visa applications, I think the officers are certainly focused on, does the individual know what their job is, right? So be ready to talk about the position that you've been offered in the U.S. and the work that you're going to be doing. So certainly being familiar with the description of the job, reviewing the job description is, I would say one of the first things they people need to review, so they just are familiar with how their job was described, to USCIS or on the blanket L. And then for people of extraordinary ability, the O1s, we'll also see officers questioning how somebody is considered to be a person of extraordinary ability, right? Like, wow, do you actually have a Nobel Prize? And so and most people obviously don't, so you do need to be able to, talk about your achievements and summarize it and show how, you do hit all the required criteria to be a person of extraordinary ability. So I would say definitely focus on job description and how somebody is qualified for the job, with the Ls being ready to talk about how you manage, if this is an L1A, if it's L1B, specialized knowledge, again, being familiar with the product or the services and how that is, qualifies under that specialized knowledge category.
Absolutely. A few months ago, there was trend that kind of popped up out of nowhere where U.S. consulates were sending O1 petitions back to the USCIS to double check and make sure that they were really people with extraordinary ability. And I think that that probably could have been avoided if the applicants were prepared and ready to defend and explain how they have extraordinary abilities. So that's just one example of how preparation will really kind of nip problems in the bud before they pop up.
Yeah. Another area that, people need to be ready to address would be prior visits to the United States. So if you were in the US previously on a student visa, did you go to school? Did you complete your degree program? Did you comply with prior visits to the US? So certainly being familiar and remember the dates you visited the United States, what was the purpose of the visit, if you were coming here on a business visa as a B1, what were you doing? So just being ready to address prior visits to the United States would be another area people should be prepared to talk about.
Definitely. Then there's always the tricky question, have you ever violated your status in the United States? So that's a very tricky one, and I think people need to be very careful about how they answer that. They do not want to be inaccurate at all.
Absolutely. And just to go back on the documents you have to bring to the interview. So the global mobility team, again, as you said, David, they should be supportive in providing a job confirmation letter. That is critical to the application. And then individuals who may have had any form of criminal infractions or arrests, always make sure you have any documents related to that with you because they are going to ask for that. So, in terms of documents, it would be, for example, a final court disposition, the arrest report. And so, if that is something in your history, you should be ready to talk about that as well.
Yes, and if there has been a conviction or even an arrest, this is something where the individual needs to probably bring in counsel. The mobility team needs to understand this is an area where the individual probably cannot handle it on their own, and this will need to be reviewed. And many times, as counsel, will need to prepare a brief to discuss whether or not this particular arrest or conviction makes somebody inadmissible. And people need to keep in mind that drunk driving in the U.S. is seen as something that's very serious when it comes to non-immigrants entering the United States. So if somebody has a drunk driving arrest, they may not be getting a visa, and perhaps they shouldn't be traveling abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. So non-immigrant visas are definitely something to prepare for at the consulate. The other time you may need to appear at the U.S. consulate for an interview would be for immigrant visas. So some people will decide instead of completing the green card process in the United States through adjustment of status, it may make sense to go back to their home country consulate to appear for an immigrant visa interview. Some folks actually live abroad and they don't have the option to do adjustment of status, and they actually do need to complete an immigrant visa interview at the US consulate. The immigrant visa interviews are certainly longer than the non-immigrant visa interviews, which typically happen at a counter. I imagine it very much to be like a bank teller window, very public, whereas an immigrant visa interview may, they do take a little bit longer, and it may or may not happen at that counter. The other thing to keep in mind with immigrant visas and any consular interview is that there is no right to counsel, and so you won't have your attorney there with you. Whereas, with the adjustment of status, for example, you could have the attorney attend with you. And so it's really critical that your team is preparing you for this immigrant visa interview. You understand what documents you need to take, everything is properly organized so that when the officer asks, you can immediately pull it out. Some people may organize their documents in an accordion folder, have originals and photocopies available because they will want to see the originals, compare with what was provided, return the originals to you. Sometimes they may want to keep a copy. So for all the documents, I always recommend having both an original and a photocopy. And again, having it all organized in an accordion folder or with, folders and tabs. Again, you don't want to have a whole pile of paper that you're going through. You just want to make sure everything is easy for you to pull out and give to the officer immediately because, the officers they get annoyed, right? If somebody doesn't know where their paperwork is and they're starting to get all flustered. So the consulate will provide very detailed instructions on the documents that you need to bring. The medical exam will happen by a panel physician in your home country. It's not done here in the US. So you do need to follow the instructions for scheduling the appointment, ahead of time so that the medical is completed before the interview and there is enough time for the physician to, forward the exam results to the consulate before the interview. Or if the individual needs to actually pick up the medical exam prior to the interview, you have enough time to do that. And then again, the officer is going to be very focused on prior visits to the United States, relationship with the family member, if this is a family-based petition. And then if it's a employment-based petition, again, they're focusing on are you qualified for the job? How did you get the job offer? Oftentimes, they'll also ask on employment-based cases if there's any familial relationship between the petitioner and the beneficiary, just to make sure that if this was, in fact, a labor certification based green card process, then you want to make sure that that was a fair test of the labor market. And if you are petitioning for a relative, then that may not be so fair. So just some things to keep in mind for immigrant visa interviews. But David, do you have any other favorite questions you prepare your clients for these interviews?
Well, one thing that I've noticed that trips people up is not really the questions, but sometimes it's the documents because, you know, people realize this has been already approved twice. There's an I-130 or an I-140 petition that's already been approved. The applications are submitted to the NBC, and sometimes the foreign national, if the applicants kind of forget that they do need some of those originals. They need their original birth certificate. They need the original marriage certificate. Sometimes the original birth certificate is not, they've sent it into the USCIS as a PDF. They've sent it to NBC as a PDF. But where is it? Where is the original? Well, it's in their mom's file cabinet back in the home country. And sometimes they don't really understand until right before the interview that they need to have that original and bring it in. And sometimes that causes a little bit of frustration and delay at the last moment. So that's one of the things that I've seen that's really caused problems. The other thing is sometimes people don't understand how long the process will take, that they're going to be back in the home country for long enough to get the medical exam done, have the medical exam transmitted to the consulate, pay all the fees, have the immigrant visa interview, and then wait for the passport to come back. Sometimes they're caught off guard, and it can take what, Naveen, a couple of weeks often?
Yeah, I mean, I would say at minimum 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, just so that,
Yeah.
you are giving that week prior for the medical, and then after the interview, it can be another 5 working days, 10 working days to receive your passport back. So certainly you do need to plan accordingly that somebody is going to be away for a while. And I would say that that's also true for the non-immigrant visa process as well, especially in jurisdictions where the fingerprinting is a separate appointment from the actual interview. And there may be a week between the biometrics appointment and the actual interview, right? So again, just to understand that the process is now much longer, and so you do need to plan for your employees being away for several weeks.
Yeah, and now that, all, non-immigrant visa interviews and immigrant visa interviews are supposed to happen in the country of nationality or residence of the applicant, there's not as much forum shopping, and so when people need to go to an interview, there might be a backlog. So especially in the case of a non-immigrant, where somebody's maybe having to leave suddenly for a funeral or an illness of a family member, there's really no telling how long they could be gone. Where it used to be, standard 2, 3 weeks, it could be much longer now because it's taking longer to get an appointment. And so mobility and HR teams will have to really look at the policies relating to working abroad in these situations, because it could be that someone could be stuck just to get their visa stamp, for 6, 8 weeks.
Yeah, the other, I guess, known unknown is, the 100K fee, right? So we don't know how to make that payment yet, and you may have someone who goes to the consulate and is being asked to present proof of payment. So
Yeah, there's no way to pay that right now. So that could cause a very significant delay, assuming that there is funding and support to pay that $100,000 fee.
yeah. So certainly a lot to keep in mind before making that trip abroad for a visa appointment. Some other potential questions on the immigrant visa side is when you have family based processes, they do want to see that the petitioner is domiciled in the United States or has taken steps to reestablish domicile, because the whole idea of petitioning for your family members so that you can all be together in the States. And so, if it's a U.S. citizen spouse who was previously living abroad, they do need to be prepared to show that they've either taken steps to move back to the U.S., they rented a home, or they are in the process of securing a job, things like that, just in case they haven't already moved to the U.S. So, something else to be prepared for on the family side.
Yeah, that could be a tricky one. We could do a whole session on domicile and what it means to be returning to a domicile. Question for you, Naveen: if an individual U.S. citizen is going back to the U.S. and plan to live with parents, and the parents confirm that they were coming back to live with them, do you think that would count as kind of like having a lease and proof that they are planning to return to the U.S.?
Sure. I mean, that could be a reason why someone decides to return to the U.S. is to come back and help look after their elderly parents, right? And part of that could be living with their parents, so they can do that and be more effective. But in addition, if they are looking for jobs, I would show that they have sent out applications for job openings in the US, that they are taking those steps if they haven't already secured a job. So then let's now move on to interviews within the U.S., right? So for green card processes, but adjustment interviews. So in the past, a lot of the employment-based interviews, were completely waived. So we haven't done these or seen these in a while, but that is being reintroduced. And even family-based interviews were often waived in the past, but again, everyone needs to be prepared for an interview now. So let's talk about adjustment interviews, David.
Adjustment interviews will happen with the agency called the USCIS. And remember, now the USCIS is not just a service agency, it's also an enforcement agency. So I've seen reports recently that interviews have a little bit more of a serious tone. And so people really do need to be prepared during this interview. First, we can talk about the family based context. The officer will do a very thorough review of the I-130 and the I-485. um, they'll review all of the documents carefully. And some of the things that I always want to key into are looking at the individual's residence history and then dates when they entered the US, when they got married, when they got certain jobs, just making sure that everything is consistent, making sure that the applicant is aware of their own timeline because it was their life, but we all forget things, especially over the years. And so people need to kind of be cognizant and remember their immigration history so that if they're asked about them, they'll be able to answer appropriately.
So not only do for family cases, for spouses, not only do you need to know your own employment history, but and for the duration of your relationship with your spouse, you should also know their employment history, quite frankly, right? Like, what kind of work did they do? Who were they working for when you started seeing each other? Were they in school? What were they studying, right? So all of those, so not only your own timeline, but also review your partner, your spouse's timeline.
Right. Right. And someone doesn't need to know everything about their spouse, but they need to have a reasonable knowledge about their spouse's life, especially during the time that they were together. Obviously, the thing in a marriage-based application, the thing that the officer is most concerned about is the bona fides of the relationship, evidence that proves that the couple is really a couple. So it's very important for the couple to bring documents that did not exist at the time of the filing of the I-130 and I-485 to prove that they're really a couple. Things like joint finances, joint taxes, photos, insurance, documents that prove that they're together. And there's a new system now, and it seems like it's a trend where the USCIS is kind of wanting people to upload these new relationship documents just prior to the interview so that there's less of kind of passing it across the desk at the interview and a little bit more of uploading them to the My USCIS account before the interview. In fact, I had one interview recently where the couple wanted to give documents to the officer, and the officer said, "No, go ahead and upload it right now on your phone." And so this is an area where a little bit of care needs to be exercised because as attorneys, we don't want the applicant to go ahead and upload things until we reviewed them. And so there's going to need to be a little bit more preparation where attorneys and counsel work together, look at the documents, approve them, and then the foreign national would upload them onto the My USCIS platform. Have you seen that in New York, Naveen?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the request is there, but I haven't actually heard of the officer not accepting it at the interview and just saying to upload it directly onto the USCIS account. But so that's interesting. I definitely think when we are preparing our clients for interviews that that we discuss this and we review the documents that they're planning to upload. The other thing to keep in mind for family-based green card processes is that the petitioner also needs to attend. Children filing for their parents, I would have both the child who or the son or daughter who's petitioning for their parent also attend the interview. And certainly it's critical for marriage cases that the US citizen spouse is there.
Definitely. Big red flag if the petitioning spouse is not present. That could be a big problem. Anything else that would be a common red flag, Naveen?
No, I think that pretty much covers for the marriage cases or the family cases. And now let's talk about how to prepare for an employment-based green card interview.
Yes. So for employment-based green card interviews, there's really two focuses. First of all, it's the foreign national and their admissibility, and then the job and the position that is offered. And a big focus of the adjustment of status interview will be whether or not the job is a legitimate job offer that's still available to the foreign national. And so, when going in for an interview, the foreign worker will have to explain a little bit about the company structure, the job title, and day to day responsibilities. And obviously, the explanation should be consistent with the way the job is described in the Perm Labor Certification and the I-140. And this is sometimes a little bit tricky because the way we do our day-to-day jobs is sometimes a little bit different than the way HR describes it, and so it's important to review that job description and make sure that that it's described in a way that's similar to the way that it's written down. Officers will also look at prior statuses. So if someone has a history where they entered the US as an F1 student, did OPT, then switched to H1B, and then ultimately got petitioned for perm, it's possible that the officer will go through that whole history and talk about the progression and make sure that the person maintained status. Naveen, what are some things that you think people need to watch out for when they go in for their employment-based adjustment interviews?
Those are all really great points. And oftentimes the employment based green card process can take several years, especially when you have visa retrogression. And so, um, for people who have been in a pending adjustments situation for a while, they may be eligible to port their green card process under AC-21, and maybe they're no longer working for the original I-140 petitioner, and they have now moved on to another employer. So those individuals definitely need to have the supplement J form as well, ready to present at the interview if it hasn't already been presented to immigration, and then to be familiar with the position that was described on the original application, and then how their new offer of employment um, is same or similar to that original job. So for those who have moved on, how that remains the same or similar occupation. For those who are still with their employer, but perhaps their position has evolved over the last few years, that they still qualify because it remains the same or similar job. And then the accompanying family members will also attend the interview. And so when you have a spouse, for example, you should also bring bona fide marriage documents because although this isn't a marriage based interview, they are still being able to complete the green card process based on the marital relationship, right? So I always prepare the US citizen spouse with joint or shared life documents. And then the spouse should also be familiar with what the principal applicant's job is, right? Who do they work for? What kind of what is their occupation? Just the basics. They don't obviously need to know the nitty-gritties.
It's a very good point. I've seen a couple of cases, especially where the marriage was kind of recent at the time of the interview, where the officer really got into the bona fides of the marriage and almost made it into a marriage-based interview. So that's a very good point, Naveen.
Yeah. And whenever there are, couples going for interviews, people should be prepared that they may be interviewed separately, right? And so each applicant needs to be familiar with the contents of the documents, right? So when you have a couple going in case you are separated, both parties should be familiar with the documents that they're taking. And so the spouse, the dependent spouse, should be familiar with all the paperwork as well, so that if separated, they can handle it on their own. And then adjustment interviews can always, you do have right to counsel, so definitely consider having an attorney appear with you. But just keep in mind that the attorney's role is fairly limited, right? Where they're mostly to observe and make sure that the officer is following proper procedure, and we can only chime in when it's like a legal question, but all the factual based questions, they need to be answered by the applicant. Something else that, to keep in mind as well, and, David, you and I have talked about this, is, uh, making sure that the family is adjudicated together, because you
Yes.
can have a situation where the principal applicant's, application is granted, but not the spouse or the child because there's an outstanding document or maybe fingerprints have been cleared. And so, what that means for the family member whose green card application or adjustment is delayed for some reason.
Yes, that's a very important point. If it, for principal applicant's adjustment is approved and the family members are not, it puts everyone in quite an awkward position because the other family members no longer have non-immigrant status. And so it's quite an awkward situation. So it's much better if you can ask the interviewer to adjudicate the family together.
Yeah, and then, a lot of times with H-and-L visa applicants who apply for adjustment of status, especially now that there's a separate fee for the advanced parole and the employment authorization card, some people decide they don't want to apply for the advanced parole because the advanced parole application may be denied if you travel on that H-and-L while the application is still pending. And so you could also have a situation where there is no advanced parole and the principal applicant adjustment's been granted, they're not permanent resident. How would the dependent spouse travel if there's no advanced parole and their non-immigrant visa is no longer valid? So, some things to keep in mind when you're planning on, supporting your employees who are going through the adjustment of status application. That maybe just think about, supporting them on the advanced parole as well, in case there are delays like that. And then because the advanced parole is something that's available to all adjustment applicants, and now that there may be this extra 100K fee, perhaps it is better to travel on the advanced parole than to potentially trigger a request for a $100,000 filing fee.
That's a good point, Naveen. In the past, I think our advice has generally been to maintain H status and travel on H status because it's legally a better and safer position to be in status. But with the $100,000 filing fee, maybe in the future, we'll be looking at utilizing the advanced parole a lot more, even for people who have had H's.
Yeah, and especially, if you're from a country with a limited reciprocity schedule, right? You can only get a single entry H-1B for 30 days, right? So
Yes.
for those individuals, and especially if you can't go back to your home country as often to get a visa issued, it might be easier to just to travel on that advanced parole. But then you also need the EAD as well. So definitely do both. And now let's pivot to naturalization interviews. They have changed a bit. I know we discussed this on our last discussion as well, but let's dive a little deeper into the naturalization interviews.
Yes. So at the naturalization interview, there are a few key points. Um, one of them is residency. So at the interview, the officer will look very carefully at the person's passport and make sure they have enough physical presence in the United States. The officer will also look very carefully about how long any departures from the United States were to determine if there is sufficient continuous residence. Now, there has been a new focus this year on good moral character, where in the past, if someone didn't have an arrest record and they paid their taxes on time, they were sort of deemed to have good moral character. And the new requirement is that the applicant has an affirmative duty to bring in proof they have good character, bring in proof that they're doing volunteer work, proof that they are involved with religious organizations, that they're connected to their community. And so there's a lot more preparation that needs to be done now than there ever was in the past. Additionally, the USCIS has now indicated that they're going to be doing neighborhood checks to make sure that someone is well disposed and supportive of the US Constitution, and that they can avoid that neighborhood check if they bring in reference letters from neighbors. And so, again, a lot more preparation, a lot more focus on that naturalization interview. But what to expect in a naturalization interview is expect that the officer will probably go through just about every question on the form. They do have the right to literally read every single question and ask you and confirm every single answer. And one thing that trips people up sometimes is the question that says, "Have you ever been arrested, indicted, convicted, or cited?" And that word cited, CITED, sometimes trips people up because I believe, and I think there's a maybe a little bit difference of opinion among attorneys. I believe that a traffic citation and moving violation is a citation needs to be disclosed on the naturalization interview. And I think that's a common mistake. But what do you think, Naveen? Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, and before the form actually said, accept traffic violations, and now it's better to err on the side of caution and say, yes, I had a parking ticket, or I've paid up all my parking tickets, and maybe have a statement from the DMV showing you don't have any outstanding tickets or any other outstanding charges. So definitely be prepared to talk about those, and it's better to disclose it, have the officer say, yeah, yeah, no big deal, than to be hit with misrepresentation. With regards to the physical presence point, I have seen officers, flip through passports to make sure that every entry exit stamp that's in the passport is accounted for on that travel history. So you do need to bring all the passports over the last 5 years, right? And then just flip through them to make sure that those trips are accounted for. And then if you have traveled since the filing, to let the officer know so that they can update your travel history with that additional, trip or two since the application was filed. So that would definitely be something to update on the application form.
Good point. Naveen, any trick questions or any common questions that people should be prepared for?
Yeah, just to be prepared for people, maintaining their dual citizenship. You can retain your passport from your home country. You don't lose that if your country otherwise allows you to maintain dual citizenship. Last point I will make also is that for all of these interviews, just to please dress professionally, right? I think first impressions make they have carry a lot of weight, right? So in when you're attending your interview at the consulate as a TN, applying for a TN at the port of entry. Again, always make sure you're dressed professionally. And so keep that in mind when you're attending an interview for your citizenship. Again, they want to see that you're giving the proceeding due respect. So impressions make a big difference. So just dress accordingly. So with that, we can wrap up our discussion for today. We hope all of this was helpful in supporting your employees as they navigate through these various complexities. Please drop your questions or comments and reach out to us directly. And please stay tuned for more insights on our next session. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.